So for that, let's turn to Rej and Ruth, who are going to tell us what on earth is going on with La Leche League. Welcome, Rej and Ruth.
Just very briefly, for those of you who don't know what LLL, La Leche League, is, it was set up in 1958 as a mother-to-mother breastfeeding support organisation. It started very locally in order to offer breastfeeding support to other local mums, and the need for it at that time was such that it grew exponentially to become an international organisation with chapters all around the world. It went from just local meetings, answering each other's questions and supporting each other, to a booklet and then a book, The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding, the latest edition of which they've dropped the womanly. It's always been a quietly radical organisation, set up at a time when doctor's word was pretty much everything, and formula was seen as the scientific and therefore better thing to do. Yeah, it used to be evidence-based, not so much anymore. So that's very, very brief overview of what LLL was set up as, at least.
Yeah, it went from this very mother-centered, woman-centered group to, there was a bit of a takeover by stealth, really, of LLLI, which is the international sort of overboard, I suppose. And we really first saw it in around 2014, where there started to be changes to language and to certain prerequisites of becoming a leader, which is what we call, or what LLL call their breastfeeding counsellors, their leaders, to accommodate Trevor, who was a trans man in Canada, who first started attending groups and then decided that she wanted to become a La Leche League leader. So we saw this beginning in changing, and then more recently they started to introduce this approach of using a variety of terms. So things like breastfeeding and chest feeding, or body feeding, or human milk feeding, or mothers and families, or mothers and lactating parents, or whatever the latest term was. And this came with various repeated assurances that, you know, nobody wants to erase the word mother, but and it all comes from a really good place, I'm pretty sure, but it comes with various risks, including making it a lot harder to understand, for example, the written materials and the advice. It's an issue for anyone. I mean, if you're a sleep-deprived new mum, it's hard enough to take anything on board, let alone if it's written in sort of gender-neutral, additive gobbledygook. But it really has an impact, a massive impact, on women with learning disabilities or low literacy levels, or English as a second language, for example. And my experience has been that the variety of terms often comes at the expense of the word mother. You tend to find it gets dropped. So you talk about lots of, you know, breastfeeding families. In my experience, I was the only one getting up in the middle of the night to breastfeed my babies. But there we go. We also saw a lot of duplicity around the term male lactation. Marion Thompson, who is one of the last two living founding mothers, who resigned last year, I think October, November, quite publicly. She sought assurance about male lactation and was told that LLL does not support male lactation and that leaders are not required to support males to lactate. But, you know, the LLI website completely contradicts this. In fact, there's a whole page dedicated to trans and non-binary breastfeeding, stating that LLL supports trans men, trans women, and non-binary people. And they also introduced an inclusion statement, which is very, very open to interpretation. I know that I felt I was able to carry on as an LLL leader despite being a sex realist, but obviously other people feel differently. But the really key thing to that inclusion statement is it misses the point that there is a difference between providing breastfeeding information to everyone, because that can include supporting the breastfeeding mother. And that's very different to offering breastfeeding support to everyone. So that's the international overview.
Actually, GB is in quite a helpful, we thought, position as being an independent charity in the UK, which means that it's answerable to the Charity Commission here, and that means something in terms of what trustees' obligations and responsibilities are. So what we saw happening in the UK was very similar to what was going on in international in terms of additive language, making things unclear, but also any attempts to talk about what was happening with language was shut down. We were told that we were harmful if we suggested there might be a difference between biological men and biological women. And not last summer, the summer before, I stepped down as the editor of Breastfeeding Matters, which was the members' magazine over the language issue. And then in the autumn, a group of us decided to stand for election to the Council of Directors. And we were successful, which meant that the board was around about 50-50 in terms of those who thought that inclusion meant including everyone in everything, and those of us who thought there's a little bit of a difference between male and female. So one of the things that we knew as directors in LLLGB was that the charitable objects and the beneficiaries of LLLGB as a UK charity were helpful, we believed, because the beneficiaries are mothers and babies, and in UK law the word mother, there is no ambiguity, and it is exactly what you would think it would mean. Whereas, as we know, with what's been going on in the Supreme Court, that's not the case for women. So the fact that our beneficiaries are mothers was very helpful, and we believed that the conflict between the inclusion policy that LLL International was telling us we had to introduce and the GB charitable objects was a problem that needed to be addressed. However, when we tried to do this, what we found was the Orwellian situation of the policy of inclusion being used against us when we tried to talk about that very policy, because it was so harmful to suggest that there was a difference. We ended up in a very convoluted year. We had complaints about us from our fellow trustees to the international board, who eventually suspended us because we shared communications between one of our trustees and the international board, which asked questions and raised concerns. We shared that with all of the GB leaders. We were suspended as a result of that. We raised a serious incident report to the Charity Commission and spoke to the press. That was used as an excuse to try and get rid of us through resolutions at an extraordinary general meeting. That failed. The international board then decided that since we'd spoken to the press and had apparently disparaged LLL International or La Leche League by suggesting that there was a conflict between the charitable objects and the inclusion policy, the complaint against us was changed. So it was no longer about having shared information. It was now about having spoken to the press. At the same time all of this was going on, we sought a legal opinion from a top KC in the UK, Aqua Rheindorf, which confirmed what we said, basically, that there was a conflict and that it would be unlawful for leaders in GB to support males with lactation. Despite knowing this, La Leche League International removed our accreditation as La Leche League leaders. I wrote in an email to them at the very end of the process when we were told that we could remain as leaders if we agreed to the policy of inclusion. I wrote in an email to them, can I just check that you're saying that in order to keep my accreditation as a leader, I need to agree to a policy that we now know is unlawful? And they said, yes, that's right. So a group of us were disaccredited. That was then used against us as part of a campaign when it came to re-election to the Council of Directors in GB come November. So now there's nobody willing to speak up about it within La Leche League GB. So they're in a position where they still can't legally follow the inclusion policy, but we're not entirely sure what's going to be happening there.
I mean, obviously, many mothers choose not to breastfeed or have issues breastfeeding, but we know that breastfeeding is good for babies and good for mums, and helps the health of mothers as well as babies. In fact, a study commissioned by UNICEF back in 2012 indicates even a slight increase in breastfeeding rates or duration of breastfeeding. Those mums who are already breastfeeding could save the NHS up to 40 million a year. And the NHS, by the way, is the National Health Service. It's our free at point of use health service over here in the UK, because I've suddenly realised there are lots of people who aren't here. So breastfeeding, we know, it can be a protective factor against diabetes and cardiovascular disease in mothers and babies. The reduction in, for example, female cancers, so ovarian cancer. I'd love to see a trans woman who has a reduction in ovarian cancer because they breastfed their baby. And also premenopausal breast cancer is, the risk is greatly reduced. So we know that breastfeeding can be very important in terms of health, but the language around it also really matters. It matters in the research, and it matters in how the information comes out. So one really good example of that is safe sleep. So with bed sharing, breastfeeding is one of the protective factors if you want to safely bed share with your baby. And as soon as you start to introduce terms about parents or chest feeding and not specifying that it's actually at the breast feeding, not bottle feeding pumped milk or feeding through an SNS, for example, it just twists the meaning and can make something that is safe unsafe. It's also things like obesity. So breastfeeding can have a protective effect against overweight in later life, and it's the method of feeding, not the substance fed, that makes the difference. So a baby who is bottle fed expressed milk, and I mean, hats off to mums who manage to express and feed exclusively that way, that still has that ramification later on down the line. But the other thing about changing the language in this way is it removes the mother from the equation. It dismisses the importance of the mother-baby dyad and diminishes the mother's role. The other issue is that taking the baby away, taking away that mother-baby dyad and reducing the importance of that, and introducing, say, a trans woman feeding pumped milk or formula through an SNS, you are then potentially irretrievably damaging that breastfeeding relationship with mum, with all those benefits conferred on mum and baby, in the quest of a man or a male person, however they identify, in their they request to have some kind of pseudo breastfeeding experience. So it's just a real danger, and I think that is sometimes lost or minimized when we're talking about this. So and those safeguarding risks go further than that. So I don't know if you want to say something about that, Ruth.
One of the things that we were trying to deal with as trustees is to talk about the safeguarding policy within La Leche League GB. And it was the absolute refusal to have the conversation that a male wanting to breastfeed was in any way a safeguarding issue, which was one of the most disturbing things that we experienced during our time as trustees, I would say. So there's quite a lot that is raised, or it's spoken about what the milk is made up of in a male who lactates. And that is an issue, but I think personally it's a distraction from the much bigger safeguarding issue of the fact that a male wants to breastfeed a baby. It's at best a man wanting to breastfeed, maybe because it's about bonding with the baby. That's the most benign reason there could possibly be. But as Rej said, that will be a disruption to the breastfeeding dyad, which would mean that successful breastfeeding of that baby and mother, their relationship, far, far less likely. Less benign reasons for a male to want to breastfeed is to use that baby as a tool in order to affirm an identity, which is abusive. And of course, there's also the absolute appalling and very, very disturbing idea that, and we know that there is the case that there are men out there who have a fetish, a lactation fetish. So there it's much, much clearer abuse. And it's just something that seems to be swept under the carpet, with the idea that, well, we'd know if it was someone who didn't have the best of intentions. It's just a fetish. And there is no good reason to support a male to lactate, to feed a baby. As I said, the idea that the breast milk might be similar, or the milk that whatever is produced in male lactation might be similar, but even if it was identical and there was nothing in the milk that could harm the baby, and we don't know that that's the case, it's still not okay under any circumstances. So there's safeguarding issues of the baby and also of mothers. One of the wonderful things about breastfeeding support groups and LLL, when it does it right, which it still does on a local level in a lot of places, I think, is the inclusion of males in breastfeeding support groups. There's the idea that you could ask the mums whether they're okay with this bloke who thinks he's a woman or says he is joining a breastfeeding group. But as one of the leaders said recently in a podcast that we took part in, she would not put it on the mothers to make that decision. It's up to the volunteers to safeguard that space for women to talk about breastfeeding. And there are so many mothers who could not attend a support group where there were men there, whether that's for reasons of being subjected to male violence, sexual violence, domestic abuse, coercive control, or because of religious restrictions, or just because it's a really vulnerable time when you've just had a baby. It's just not okay on any level. And if we can't name what is going on, we can't do that protection of a really important space. And if you want to include trans women, you can't keep out any men, because either it's a single sex space or it's not. So then you could have the loveliest bloke in the world who's there, who just wants to support the mother of his child, but it means that the space is no longer a safe space to talk about breastfeeding without worrying about the dad's feelings, because men do want to give a bottle so that they can bond with the baby. And it's the prioritization of men's feelings over women's needs, which I'm fairly sure there's no one here who would think that that's a good plan. And it's also a question of safeguarding volunteers. We all know the statistics about what proportion of women have been subjected to male violence. Volunteers, and certainly all electorally breastfeeding counsellors are volunteers. They are just as likely to have been subjected to male violence as the mothers who come. So implementing or imposing an inclusion strategy, which is for everyone to come along to support meetings, takes away the ability of those women to put their own boundaries in place for themselves as well as for other women. And some meetings take place in homes, in leaders' homes. And it's not the same welcoming a bloke into your own personal space as it is to welcome other mothers. And finally, it's all about inclusion. That's what we were told, that we were anti-inclusion when we were trying to say, no, it's not okay to include males. Both Rej and I were told that we were very harmful around this. And when we talked about the inclusion of males leading to the exclusion of women who would exclude themselves for the reasons I've mentioned, we were told, well, people exclude for all sorts of reasons, which may well be true, but it's not okay to prioritise the wrong people. And as one of our other colleagues says, mother itself is an inclusion strategy, which we very firmly believe. So, and Rej is going to tell you a little bit about what's next for us, given that we've all been booted out of Rej League, both as breastfeeding counsellors and trustees. We are no longer have any affiliation to it.
So what next? We are setting up a new organisation. We are
in the UK.
Sorry, in the UK. Sadly not international yet. But we are taking inspiration from the original mission of LLL and the whole philosophy and the concept statements. It does take time though. We are, progress is good, but it does take time. And we also really want it to be sustainable and for the growth of it to be organic. So we're going to take it slowly, within reason. But yeah, watch this space. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to getting back to just supporting mums and not having all this politics and pandering to men, frankly. So all really positive for the future, I think.